What does it mean to endure? Is it to claw your way back from the brink of extinction, only to be pushed there again? When every battle threatens to be your last, what keeps a warrior fighting? Perhaps true endurance is having the strength to stand back up after everything has been taken from you. Few chapters in the history of the Adeptus Astartes have suffered as greatly as the Lamenters. Born during the infamous 21st founding, clad in bright yellow armor and bearing the distinctive image of a bleeding heart set against a black and white checkered field, they have suffered disaster after disaster. Betrayal, annihilation, and loss on a scale that would have broken almost any other brotherhood. Entire generations of warriors have been swept away. Hard-fought victories have so often been painfully short-lived, followed all too soon by fresh tragedy, until even their greatest triumphs seem destined to fade into bitter memories. Time and again, they have been pushed to the edge of oblivion, yet time and again, they have endured, refusing to surrender, refusing to abandon the oaths that have defined them since their founding. Shunned and branded cursed by the very Imperium they exist to protect, their history viewed by many as nothing more than an unbroken chain of terrible misfortune. Regardless, the Lamenters have earned a reputation unlike any other chapter in the Imperium. Their history is not one of unbroken victory, nor of glorious conquest. Theirs is a story of deep tragedy, of sacrifice, of resilience, and of a brotherhood that has continued to fight even when fate itself seems determined to see them fall. On the cusp of the 36th millennium, shortly before the Age of Apostasy, the Imperium sought to strengthen its defenses through the creation of new chapters of Adeptus Astartes. Among those formed during this period were the Lamenters, a successor chapter of the Blood Angels created during the mysterious 21st founding, remembered throughout Imperial history as the Cursed Founding. Unlike most previous foundings, the 21st was born not only from necessity, but from ambition. On Mars, the genitors of the Adeptus Mechanicus sought to improve upon the Emperor's work. By refining flawed gene seed and correcting the inherited imperfections of existing chapters, they hoped to create a new generation of Space Marines freed from the genetic weaknesses carried since the days of the Great Crusade. Instead, they unleashed a legacy of tragedy. Exactly what transpired within the gene vaults of Mars has long been lost to history, buried beneath millennia of secrecy, dogma, and fear. What is known is that many of the chapters created during the 21st founding would meet catastrophically dark fates. Some succumbed to horrific genetic corruption, others mutated beyond recognition, fell to chaos, or were destroyed by those they had once called brothers. For the Lamenters, however, their own creation appeared to represent an extraordinary achievement. Like all chapters of the Cursed Founding, it is believed their gene seed was deliberately altered by the Magos biologists overseeing the project. In the Lamenters' case, those efforts seemed to have been directed towards eliminating the inherited flaws that had plagued the Blood Angels since the death of their Primarch, Sanguinius. For centuries, the impossible seems to have been achieved. Neither the terrible madness of the Black Rage, nor the insatiable hunger of the Red Thirst seemed to afflict brothers of the chapter. Only in the closing years of the 41st millennium would scattered reports begin to suggest that the Black Rage had returned once more, casting fresh uncertainty over what had once seemed a miraculous achievement. To many within the Imperium, the mark of the Cursed Founding could never truly be erased. Regardless of their well-documented loyalty and great sacrifices, the Lamenters were often regarded with quiet distrust by allies who could not look past the deep shadow of their origins. Ironically, while many of the genetic horrors feared by the Imperium initially did not emerge, the chapter instead became associated with something far more difficult to explain. Wherever the Lamenters fought, disaster seemed to follow. Whether this was merely an extraordinary chain of coincidental misfortune or evidence of some deeper flaw has never been established, but over the centuries it has only reinforced the fearful reputation that surrounds them. Some records speak of a quiet melancholy that seems to linger amongst the chapter's warriors. Whether this was an unforeseen consequence of their altered gene seed or simply the burden of tragedies that would come to define them remains unknown. What is known is that a deep sorrow plagues the chapter. When several chapters of the 21st Founding later descended into open rebellion and corruption within the early 37th millennium, the Lamenters chose a different path. Rather than become embroiled in civil war alongside their ill-fated brethren, they turned away from the Imperium's internal conflicts altogether. As a fleet-based chapter, they set course for the distant frontiers of the galaxy, carrying the Emperor's wars to the enemies beyond his borders instead. For the next 15 centuries, the Lamenters remained upon an unending crusade. Across the western reaches of the galaxy, they answered countless distress calls, came to the aid of isolated Imperial worlds, and fought campaign after campaign against the Xenos races that threatened humanity's frontier. Their record became one of unquestionable courage and steadfast loyalty. Yet, wherever they fought, misfortune never seemed far behind. Even after centuries of faithful service, the shadows cast by the 21st Founding would never truly abandon them. When the High Lords of Terror recalled the Lamenters toward the heart of the Imperium during the 39th millennium to help counter the growing threat posed by the Eye of Terror, they returned not as celebrated heroes, but as warriors still burdened by suspicion. That distrust would reach its darkest expression during the siege of Corellia. As the forces of Abaddon the Despoiler descended upon the Hive world during the 9th Black Crusade, the Lamenters prepared to stand alongside the Mortifactors chapter in its defense. Instead, the Mortifactors abandoned the world entirely. Bound by superstition and unwilling to fight beside warriors they believed to be cursed, they withdrew rather than serve alongside the sons of the 21st Founding. The people of Corellia were left with only one chapter of the Emperor's Angels willing to stand between them and the mighty Black Legion. The Lamenters could have withdrawn. They could have preserved their already depleted strength and awaited reinforcements. Instead, they chose to remain. For 6 relentless weeks, they fought alone against the corrupted warbands of the Black Legion. They held the Hive world with a grim determination, refusing to abandon its people despite mounting casualties and dwindling supplies. Relief came only when a battle group led by the Ultramarines and White Scars finally shattered the Chaos Blockade and broke through to the embattled world. But the victory had come at an appalling cost. Barely 200 Lamenters remained alive, and worse was still to come. Soon after departing Corellia, the battered chapter fleet vanished into a warp storm. Many believed the Lamenters had finally met the fate so often predicted for them. But more than a century later, they emerged once more on the edge of Segmentum Solar, having fought their way back from the outer void. Their long ordeal did little to diminish their resolve. When Chapter Master Marnius Calgar of the Ultramarines later called for aid during the Corinth Crusade, the Lamenters answered without hesitation, mindful of the ancient debt they believed they owed the Ultramarines for their salvation upon Corellia. Among the many campaigns that followed, none would come to define them more than the liberation of the Orc mining world known as Slaughterhouse 3. Millions of Imperial citizens had been enslaved within its vast mines, condemned to lives of unimaginable hardship beneath the rule of their greenskin captors. When the time came for the assembled chapters to attempt liberation of the citizens they were sworn to protect, it was the Lamenters who volunteered to lead the assault. Fighting with characteristic determination, they shattered the world's orbital defenses, crushed the organized Orc resistance, and liberated the planet in a matter of hours. Yet even so, as so often happens throughout the Lamenters' history, victory brought with it a terrible price. Over 3 million freed prisoners now looked to the Lamenters for salvation, but the chapter possessed neither the ships nor the manpower to evacuate so many souls before overwhelming Orc reinforcements inevitably arrived. But once again, the chapter refused to abandon those they had come to save. For days they fought tirelessly, while their tech marines rushed to restore captured Orc vessels to operational status. Battle Brothers fell in mounting numbers as wave after wave of greenskins descended upon the shattered world. When it became clear that the surviving civilians could not all be saved, those remaining of the freed prisoners made a heartbreaking request of their liberators. Rather than face enslavement once more, they asked for the Emperor's peace. With no other path remaining, the Lamenters detonated a vast network of seismic charges buried throughout the planet's mines, collapsing the tunnels and entombing millions beneath the surface. Fewer than 100 battle brothers escaped the world alive, alongside only a fraction of those they had fought so desperately to rescue. Strategically, the campaign was hailed as a great Imperial victory. The destruction of the Orc mining complex crippled enemy industry across the region for years to come. For the Lamenters, however, it was another triumph that tasted only of bitter ashes. When Marneus Calgar later sought to honor the chapter for its sacrifices with the offering of an iron halo, the Lamenters quietly refused the award. To them, there was nothing to celebrate. But to others, their strange refusal became just another reason to view the chapter with suspicion. Despite everything they had suffered to this point, they again trudged on. Once more they answered the Imperium's call, eventually becoming one of the chapters entrusted with guarding the turbulent Maelstrom Zone as one of the Maelstrom Wardens. There, they patrolled the dangerous reaches surrounding the Great Warp Anomaly, hunting pirates, raiders, and the Servants of Chaos wherever they were found. It was here that the Lamenters found something they had seldom known throughout their long history: trust. Under Chapter Master Luft Huron, the Astral Claws welcomed the Lamenters as equals. They fought together across countless campaigns, sharing victories, resources, and the spilling of blood. Huron offered the chapter not only respect, but the war material needed to rebuild and maintain their strength, something few others had ever been willing to provide. After centuries spent beneath the crushing weight of suspicion, they had finally found brothers who judged them by their deeds rather than the circumstances of their birth. For a chapter that had spent centuries fighting desperately to earn the respect of its fellow Astartes, the friendship of the Astral Claws seemed almost like vindication. Sadly, it would later prove to be the greatest tragedy in their long and sorrowful history. As Chapter Master Luft Huron sought to strengthen the Maelstrom Zone, long-simmering disputes with the High Lords of Terror over taxation, governance, and military authority steadily escalated. Believing the Imperium had abandoned its support of the region while still demanding vast tithes, Huron diverted resources towards expanding its defenses, a decision that was ultimately condemned as open defiance. Imperial forces were dispatched to restore order, other Space Marine chapters were drawn into the conflict, and before long the Badab sector had descended into a brutal civil war. Brother turned against brother in a conflict that would claim millions of lives and forever stain the honor of all those who took part. As tensions between the Astral Claws and the Imperium escalated into open conflict, the Lamenters stood beside the chapter that had fought alongside them for decades. They had bled together as the Maelstrom Wardens, defended the same worlds and buried the same dead. When called upon, the Lamenters answered not out of ambition or dreams of rebellion, but out of loyalty to brothers they believed had been wronged. While war spread across the Badab sector, the Lamenters found themselves constantly in motion. Their fleet escorted vital supply convoys, reinforced isolated battlefronts, and fought a relentless war of attrition across the southern reaches of the conflict. Month after month, their strength dwindled, but they remained one of the most capable forces available to the Successionists. Loyalist forces recognized this and resolved to cripple the Lamenters when they were most vulnerable. Such an opportunity would soon present itself above the feral world of Optera. There, the chapter's main fleet had paused in orbit to replenish supplies. Before it could regroup, the Minotaurs struck with devastating speed, crippling the plasma drives of the Lamenters' flagship, trapping their fleet within the system. However, the attack threatened far more than a single warship. Aboard the crippled flagship lay the Lamenters wounded and their precious reserves of gene seed. Should the vessel be lost, the future of the chapter would most likely be lost with it. For 17 relentless hours, the void around the planet became a graveyard of burning warships. The Lamenters fought desperately, the life of their chapter literally depending on it, but the Minotaurs pressed their assault with overwhelming aggression. Boarding torpedoes tore into ancient hulls, unleashing bronze power-armored warriors directly into the heart of the Lamenters' ships. Battle barges exchanged devastating broadsides at point-blank range. Eventually, with their ships crippled and their warriors slain by the hundreds, the surviving Lamenters made a decision almost unheard of in the history of the Adeptus Astartes. They surrendered. It was not an act of cowardice, however, but one of preservation. A mere 311 Battle Brothers survived the battle to be incarcerated, leaving only a handful of scattered garrisons located across the stars. For all practical purposes, the Lamenters had been broken. When the Badab War finally came to its bloody conclusion, the surviving successionist chapters were summoned before a court of their fellow chapter masters. There, judgment would be passed not only upon their actions, but whether they deserved to survive at all. The court found the Lamenters guilty, not of heresy, treachery, or of falling to chaos, but of being blinded by loyalty. In standing beside the Astral Claws, they had broken faith with the wider Imperium, and for that, they would be required to atone. Their sentence was a century-long Penetant Crusade. For 100 years, they would wage the Emperor's War without respite, forbidden from recruiting new Battle Brothers to replace those who fell. Every casualty would diminish the chapter still further, and whether the Lamenters survived their punishment would rest solely upon their own battered shoulders. Their battle banner, reduced to little more than torn fragments by the war, was entrusted to the Adeptus Sororitas for restoration before the chapter departed. Tradition holds that the sisters wept as they repaired it, contemplating the sins inflicted against the Emperor by those who carried it. Thereafter, it became known as the Banner of Tears. Bearing it, the chapter departed upon its long penance, fighting with a terrific fervor, desperate to atone for their guilt. Unfortunately, for those remaining Battle Brothers, it led them directly into the path of a truly horrific foe. It led them to High Fleet Kraken. As the Tyranid invasion swept across the Imperium, the Lamenters once again found themselves fighting hopeless battles against an enemy without number. On world after world, they resisted the Great Devourer, their presence proving instrumental in slowing its relentless advance. When the Second Tyrannic War finally ended, the cost to their already dwindling numbers had been catastrophic. But the chapter would, once again, endure. Shortly before the opening of the Great Rift, Commander Dante sought to gather every surviving son of Sanguinius for a desperate defensive Baal against the approaching High Fleet Leviathan. This summons reached the Lamenters, but perhaps for the first time in their history, they refused a call to war. It was not a decision born from cowardice or disloyalty, but of simple reality. Decimated by centuries of repeated devastation, and lacking both the ships and manpower required to wage another great campaign, the chapter knew that answering the call would almost certainly mean its extinction. Rather than offer false hope, the Lamenters spoke the truth. Dante accepted their decision without bitterness, recognizing that only brothers bound by genuine trust and loyalty to the Blood Angels Brotherhood would answer with such honesty. To him, their refusal was not a betrayal, but a reminder that despite everything the Lamenters had endured, the bonds between the sons of Sanguinius remained strong and unbroken. In the era Indomitus, with their century-long Penitent Crusade fulfilled, Rabute Gilliman tracked down the remaining Lamenters to provide them with desperately needed reinforcements in the form of newly created Primaris Space Marines. Though these reinforcements were modest compared to those received by many other chapters, the bolstering to their ranks provided a direly needed increase in both their fighting strength and morale. Today, the chapter grinds on, continuing to slowly rebuild, still carrying the scars of a history unlike that of any other successor of Sanguinius. The Lamenters remain, at their core, a chapter shaped by the teachings of both their Primarch and of the Codex Astartes. In theory, their organization mirrors that of a conventional Codex-compliant chapter. 10 companies, each with a prescribed battlefield role, from the veteran First Company to the scout companies responsible for training the next generation of Battle Brothers. In practice, however, the chapter has rarely enjoyed the luxury of such order. Repeated disasters, slow recruitment, and centuries rebuilding from constant exposure to the brink of extinction have made maintaining full chapter strength almost impossible. Throughout much of their history, the Lamenters have fought with only a fraction of the 1,000 Space Marines prescribed by the Codex, their companies frequently existing well below intended strength. Rather than deploying entire companies, the chapter instead fights through highly flexible strike forces, assembled from whatever warriors are available at the time. Veterans, battle line squads, assault specialists and heavy support elements are drawn together as necessity demands, allowing rapid adaptation despite constant strain on their numbers. Like many of the Blood Angel's successors, the Lamenters are also a fleet-based chapter, possessing no homeworld from which to recruit or govern. Instead, they travel among the stars, venturing wherever the Imperium has greatest need. New aspirants are gathered throughout these long voyages, recruited from feudal worlds, isolated Imperial colonies, and frontier settlements. Rather than relying upon a single population, the chapter has long drawn its future warriors from across the breadth of the Imperium. For much of their history, the Lamenters have operated without the dependable logistical support enjoyed by many other chapters. Their reputation often left them isolated from potential allies, forcing them to become unusually self-reliant. Armor, ammunition, replacement war gear, and even recruits can rarely be taken for granted. This necessity has fostered flexibility. Separated fleets have learned to fight independently for years at a time. Commanders have adapted to operating with whatever sparse resources are available, while repeated disasters taught the chapter to value pragmatism over rigid adherence to doctrine wherever survival demands it. Even so, the influence of their genetic heritage remains unmistakable upon the battlefield. The Lamenters favor rapid shock assaults, delivering overwhelming force through Thunderhawk and Stormraven gunships before closing swiftly with the enemy. Boarding actions, orbital insertions, and aggressive airborne assaults have become hallmarks of their combat doctrine, allowing relatively small strike forces to achieve decisive results against significantly larger foes. Their long years without a permanent home have also shaped the equipment they carry. Unlike many of the fellow sons of Sanguinius, the Lamenters possess comparatively few of the ancient relics and specialized war machines associated with the Blood Angels. Heavy support vehicles such as Land Raiders and Baal Predators are uncommon within the chapter, while suits of Terminator armor are exceptionally rare. Those relics that do remain are preserved with extraordinary care, each regarded as irreplaceable. One institution, however, has always stood at the very heart of the chapter. Like the Blood Angels themselves, the Lamenters' apothecaries serve not only as battlefield physicians, but as members of an order known as the Calyx. Holding a position of exceptional authority within the chapter, these sanguinary priests safeguard both the physical health of their brothers and the purity of the chapter's gene seed. As scattered reports of the Black Rage and Red Thirst have slowly begun to re-emerge in recent centuries, their responsibilities have only grown more vital. It is often said that more than any captain or chapter master, it has been the Calyx that has held the Lamenters together through the countless tragedies they have experienced throughout their existence. For a chapter whose history is so often associated with sacrifice rather than conquest, it is perhaps fitting that the Lamenters possess remarkably few legendary heroes of note. Many of those who might have become celebrated across the Imperium instead perished. Those who are remembered tend to embody not only the courage of the Lamenters, but also the burdens they have carried for millennia. Foremost among them stands the chapter master, Malachim Pharos, known by titles such as the Lord of Ruin and the Watcher of the Deeps. To his brothers, Pharos represents a living embodiment of the chapter itself, a warrior of immense determination who constantly fought not only the enemies of mankind, but the darkness growing within his own soul. As the Black Rage slowly re-emerged amongst the Lamenters in the closing years of the 41st millennium, Pharos was known to battle ferociously upon the very edge of madness, repeatedly dragging himself back from the abyss through sheer force of will. Official Imperial records state that he perished when the Lamenters were finally defeated by the Minotaurs, but recent rumors continue to persist that the chapter master somehow survived the relentless assault, eventually rejoining his brothers. Whether these stories hold any truth remains unknown. Another renowned son of the chapter is the venerable dreadnought Chiron. Temporarily seconded to the Death Watch during the Lamenters' disastrous encounters with Hive Fleet Kraken, Chiron escaped the annihilation that claimed so many of his brothers. Tragically, for many years he believed himself to be the sole surviving Lamenter in existence, continuing his eternal service beneath that heartbreaking misconception. The Death Watch has also counted other Lamenters among its honoured ranks, including Brother Semnai, a veteran whose long years of service carried him to the furthest reaches of the galaxy. Much of his history remains deliberately obscured, his mission reports sealed beneath layers of inquisitorial secrecy, leaving only fragments of his remarkable career preserved within Imperial records. Though few in number, these warriors reflect the enduring spirit of their chapter, steadfast, self-sacrificing, and resolute even when surrounded by despair. The greatest heroes of the Lamenters are remembered not because fate favored them, but because they continued to fight despite it. What then does it truly mean to endure? For the Lamenters, it has never meant achieving glorious conquest or standing forever undefeated upon the battlefield. Instead, their history is one of impossible burdens carried out without complaint. A chapter born beneath the shadow of the cursed founding, distrusted by the Imperium they swore to defend, broken by wars they fought out of loyalty rather than ambition, reduced time and time again to the precipice of extinction, only to rise once more from the ashes. Again and again, fate has appeared determined to erase them, and yet, it never quite has. Despite everything, the Lamenters continue to answer humanity's call. They continue to wage the Emperor's wars. They continue to uphold the oaths they first swore upon their founding over 5,000 years ago, not because they are the strongest of the Adeptus Astartes, not because they have claimed the greatest victories, but because they embody something far rarer: unrelenting determination to continue even when every reason to do so has been stripped mercilessly away from them. In a galaxy where honor is so often rewarded with betrayal, where sacrifice leads only to further suffering, and where compassion is so easily mistaken for weakness, the Lamenters have never abandoned their ideals. They continue to fight for worlds they will never call home, to defend people who may never know their names, and to uphold their oaths regardless of how many times fate has punished them for doing so. The Lamenters may never stand amongst the Imperium's most celebrated chapters, or reclaim the strength they once possessed, and perhaps their long history of misfortune is far from over. But so long as even a single battle brother still bears the bleeding heart upon his shoulder, the sorrowful legion lives on.